Thank you, Charles. Dr. Ivory Toldson, coming to us from DC. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. All right. Well, it's so good to be here. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this very important teach-in. I've gotten a chance to listen to some of the presenters and looking forward to listening to more. And all of the presenters are really capturing the essence of why education is so important and why it's so important for us to fight for fair, free, and bias-free education. So today I'm going to talk about parents. I'm going to talk about the majority of parents that represent students, and these are parents who look like me, parents who are of color, parents who are of conscious, parents who represent the new norm, the new majority, and also the parents that are being silenced. The title of my presentation is that if my ancestors had to live it, or if my ancestors were strong enough to live it, then your children should be strong enough to learn it. Centering diverse parents in the CRT debate. I'm going to talk about some survey data and some of my own observations and personal history, and talk about how or why it's important for the new majority to speak out, and also the absurdity of the way that a lot of these laws are written, because they're written in such a way that they should represent people like me if taken in the proper context. But because they're specifically designed to attract bigots, we have just kind of accepted the letter of the law as being something that is not for people of color. So parents of color, parents of conscious represent the majority of parents who have children who are in public schools right now. Today we have the most diverse student population in history. Now, just recently, the NAACP sponsored a survey. This is a survey of 1,625 adults, and it revealed that most parents, and this is consistent with a lot of other surveys, but most parents are interested in their children learning an accurate history that involves the atrocities that were committed against Black people, Indigenous people, and other marginalized groups in the United States. In the survey, there was equal representation between Black, Asian, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latino, Indigenous, and white adults. And if you looked at the majority with this equal distribution, the majority were interested in their children learning about race. Now, interestingly, so among all the survey participants, the survey participants felt like parents should have the most say in what their children are taught and how it's taught. Now, one of the interesting differences in the races in the survey is that the majority of white survey participants indicated that teachers should have the least to say about race and history, placing educators beneath governors and state lawmakers. So this was one peculiarity, one difference that we saw in white participants. Now, the same survey found that 39% of all participants had a favorable view of critical race theory, but the majority did not know what critical race theory was. So clearly, we have some politicians that are exploiting this knowledge gap to try to define what CRT is when most people don't really know what it is. But the majority of Black participants had a favorable view from what they knew about it, and the greater proportion of white people had an unfavorable view from what they thought they knew about it. Now, another racial difference in this survey is the white participants, about 46% believe that too much attention is paid to race and racial issues in the United States. That contrasts to 56% of Black respondents that believe that too little attention is paid to race. So there's a mismatch there. Also, among all participants, the majority, over 60%, felt like the government addressing racism would have a positive impact on the country. And this is a finding that was supported by other media polls, including USA Today, Reuters, Slate. All of them illustrate that most adults support teaching honest history and dealing with the effects of slavery and racism. So the NAACP findings underscore a trend. Nationally, some politicians are focusing on parents' rights. Most people believe that parents should have rights. But the way that a lot of our politicians are defining parents, they're actually lifting up the minority, the new minority of parents. They're normalizing white parents, they're normalizing bigoted parents. And so when they say things like Governor Youngkin in Virginia, setting up this email tip line so that parents could report so-called divisive schools, he's not talking about Black parents who may be in a school situation where they're feeling threatened because of their race. This would be a divisive practice, but that's not who he's talking about. Similarly, in Florida, which is the target of this teach-in, but there is legislation that prohibited schools from teaching aspects of history that made people feel discomfort. So who are these people who feel discomfort? So it's a peculiar way that they are normalizing prejudiced white parents and casting them against these phantom teachers who are so-called indoctrinating their children. So let's talk about discomfort. When we think about CRT, and when you try to make it seem like that's something that can create certain students, the normal student, feel discomfort, let's try to unpack that a bit and see how that may relate to the experiences of someone like me. So, for instance, when I was in 11th grade, I felt discomfort in my American history class when my teacher said that slavery was not something that would be something that we would have today, but back then it was just a way of life. And she said that some slaves, in her words, had good relationships with their slave masters, in her words. So I felt extreme discomfort when she expressed these views. And my response to her was, I asked her, I raised my hand and I said, do you call someone getting their foot amputated because they're trying to escape? Do you call that good relationships? And so she shut me down. She said, Ivory, shut up. I remember she did that with her hand. Shut up. So I'm not going to take that out of you today. So I felt further discomfort. Now, again, this is a language that these politicians are using. They don't want children to feel discomfort. Clearly, I was feeling discomfort from that dialogue. So much discomfort, in fact, that I got anxious. And when she passed my seat, I put my foot out. So I acted outside of myself. I put my foot out for her to trip over it. She stumbled a bit, and then she wrote me up and sent me to the principal's office. So I tried to argue my point. I got shut down. I felt discomfort, so I acted outside of my best self because I was feeling discomfort in that situation. Now, if we had strong CRT or anti-CRT legislation that protected all students from their discomfort, then I may have been spared from any type of suspension or anything like that because I was made to feel discomfort and humiliated in that class. But again, this legislation is not written for people like me. Now, luckily, when I went to the principal's office, I didn't get suspended. I remember telling the assistant principal what happened in class, and he was surprised that I was in his office because he had never seen me in his office before. I wasn't a troublemaker. So I told him about the debate, and he said, "You know what they call people like you?" And I was kind of braced myself. I didn't know what they call people like me, but he said, "They call people like you critical thinkers." And he said, you can't, uh, if you ever thought about going to college, that would be a good time for you to have those types of debates. But those debates don't really work that well in high school. So I just, took that odd lesson. But I was flattered and honored that he thought I was a critical thinker. That was actually the first time I heard that terminology. But if it would get me out of suspension, then that's what I would take. So that was an example of, and it's interesting. I shared this story during in January for a MLK Day lecture, and there was a community college student in the audience, and she said she had the exact same experience when she was in high school only 2 years ago. I had that experience about 30 years ago. So we see that these experiences continue to repeat themselves. And again, it speaks to the discomfort that Black and Brown students and other marginalized students have all of the time, but is written up in legislation directly related to white students. So that is a really why critical race theory exists, because our experiences are marginalized and other experiences are normalized. So the relationship between intent and enforcement of these laws are set up to disadvantage diverse learners. They're not written necessarily. If you look at the pure letter of the law, they're not written to disadvantage diverse learners, but the intent is to disadvantage diverse learners. When we talk about parents' right to know, again, this is something that is being weaponized to silence educators who are having an honest conversation about race with their students. And so, parents do want the right to know. But again, the majority of parents are parents of color and parents of consciousness. But the laws, when they say parents' right to know, they are not speaking to the majority of parents. When they talk about people not being held accountable for their ancestors, that's another thing that is a blatant attempt to single out a certain group of people. So I want to talk about my ancestors. So my great, great, great grandfather was a white enslaver in Kentucky who raped and enslaved African women on the plantation. She gave birth to my great great grandfather, Granderson Kahn. Granderson Kahn was half white, half Black. And when this white slave owner in Kentucky relocated to North Louisiana, he brought his son, conceived of rape, with him to be his slave. Then he started to have children with his wife. So he had his oldest son, because Granderson Kahn was his first son. So his oldest son, he considered him property, and then he had children that he considered his sons and daughters. So my great grandfather, my great great grandfather, Grandison Khan, lived among his half siblings, and when his half siblings went to school, they came back and started to teach him the things that they learned in school. As a young adult, he became free, and this is when the Civil War broke out. So Grandison Khan went and fought for the Union Army, to fight in the Union Army. After he served his time in the Army, he returned to North Louisiana as a veteran. He became a minister. He had a daughter, my great grandmother, who had a son named John Henry Scott. That's my grandfather. That's the one that I can remember. I remember my grandfather, John Henry Scott, when I was a young child. I remember going fishing with him. I remember working in his garden. And he was also the president of the NAACP of North Louisiana at a time when the NAACP was illegal. He was a civil rights activist that was fighting for Black people's right to vote. For his efforts, there was an assassination attempt where he was shot, but he survived the bullet wound. And so that is my grandfather. So I share that to say that in my lineage, I have people who I can be proud of, but I also have an ancestor who was a white enslaver who raped a woman from Africa that he enslaved, someone I'm not proud of. But I know how to not be ashamed of who I am because of what one of my ancestors did. So when someone like Governor DeSantis says that you should not be ashamed because of something your ancestors did, is he talking to me? Because I have those ancestors. And the irony is that Governor DeSantis does not. His ancestors are Italian. So if there's anybody that should speak on whether or not you should learn about these people, it should be Black people, because most of us have those as our ancestors. And again, people like Governor DeSantis and Donald Trump, they do not. They don't have the right to talk about whether or not someone who has someone who owns slaves as their ancestors, they don't have the right to say whether or not they should learn in school because they don't have those ancestors. I do. But again, it goes back to what they consider to be the person and the people that they are trying to protect. They are explicitly trying to protect white people from discomfort, not Black people. So these are all of the things that are important for us to understand within the context of how this debate is being rolled out. So when politicians support these anti-critical race theory laws, they distort critical race theory to generate fear. And when we think about the way that some of these laws are written, some of them almost sound pro-CRT. Like they were writing the law things like it's illegal to teach that one race is superior to another race. Okay, I can hear you all live from Florida. Okay, can you all hear me? All right. Okay, we're good. Okay. All right. So the way that the laws are written, it's a very peculiar thing, because a lot of times they're calling themselves anti-CRT laws, but if you look at the letter of the law, they're actually pro-CRT. So for instance, most of the laws have this clause that no race should be taught that they are superior to another race. So CRT teaches that race-based discrimination is wrong. And according to critical race theory, privilege is socially ascribed. It's not inherited to individuals. So CRT argues that systems of meritocracy have been constructed to favor one race or over another, recognizing this fact does not single out individuals. Also, they talk about a lot of these laws talk about the moral character of individuals. It says it's illegal to say that one race, just by virtue of their race, has a lower moral character. This is not anything that critical race theory teaches. In fact, critical race theory helps us to get away from this individual interpretation of racism. It helps us to understand that racism is embedded in systems, not individuals. So when you look at the letter of the law, it's not consistent with what CRT is at all. Also, these laws, as I addressed earlier, they talk about these individual feelings of discomfort, guilt, or anguish. These laws that are focused on these types of things, if they weren't targeting a certain race, if these laws weren't targeting a certain race, then these are things that most marginalized students could be able to use in order to create a better environment for them. But in fact, these are not laws that are meant to protect them. A lot of these laws also have language like you can't teach that the United States is a fundamentally racist nation. CRT does not teach that. In fact, it teaches that racism is an aberration of our nation's true potential. CRT believes in the United States, and it believes that that if you were able to expose and root out racism, then this nation could live up to its potential. If CRT believed that this was fundamentally, or taught that this was fundamentally a bad nation, then it would just teach that we need to leave this nation, which it doesn't. CRT basically teaches us that we should have achieved racial harmony by creating fair and just systems under the law. And so diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that are grounded in CRT helps to reduce division, and it helps and resentment, and helps to create a system where everybody is treated fairly. So all of these things that are embedded in a lot of these laws, it doesn't really speak to CRT. And again, the letter of it are things that we could be able to get behind if it wasn't for the very obvious intent to sow this type of division. So I want to wrap it up with this, some of the things that I think we should do. So one of the things is we need to challenge not teaching inclusive history and show that these dominant narratives that promote white supremacy by focusing solely on white parents and white-centered lens of history is something that's wrong. We need to promote anti-racism and social justice in education. We need to amplify the perspectives of racially and culturally diverse parents. And we need to call the media out for kind of buying in our kind of endorsing this story that white parents are the ones that are the norm in society. We need to make sure that the new majority, our voices are being amplified. We also need to promote political involvement. among this new majority of parents who favor honest history. And finally, we need to encourage our educators to build relationships with parents and caregivers with clear information about what social justice education is and what CRT means. So all of these things are vitally important for us to move forward. So I'm going to wrap up here. If there's any questions, I think that there may be some questions that might be populating the chat. If there's any questions that pop up, I will certainly address them. But if not, this is the content of my presentation. I hope that you all gain something from it. And I'm looking at the chat now. I don't see anything, but I'll keep looking for a few more minutes.
Hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Domke. I'm one of the hosts for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Are you joining us from Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk and for the work. And I wanted to ask you about the concept of comfort, because you gave this powerful story about the discomfort that you felt, and probably people of color, BIPOC individuals feel all the time in some of the things that are taught. What would be your recommendation for that story that you shared, where a teacher was teaching some content, maybe you could remind us exactly what you said, okay? And what would be your because we have a lot of educators watching this, okay? What would be your recommendation for how that, like, let's role play that one through again. What would be the way that you might recommend it go?
Yeah, so teaching about the period of slavery is something that every educator needs to learn how to do effectively. They should not teach about slaves. They should teach about Black people during the period of slavery, because they were people. We were people. We were people who escaped, people who stayed as a form of survival, people who were free, people who were abolitionists, people who started maroon colonies, people who led insurrections, people who helped to tip off the Civil War by attacking Harper's Ferry. So we need to learn how to teach about that period of time. Now, in my case, I had a white teacher who was reckless and indignant in the way that she taught it. I knew that she was wrong. I tried to express that to her by calling her out and on that good relationship, and I gave an example of a punishment that someone who was enslaved and trying to escape might get, and asked her if she thought that was a good relationship, and she got upset and shut me down. I did, as a 15-year-old, my next response was something that was erratic, something that I wouldn't suggest other people do. But that's the course that I took. Now, what do we do now? We continue to fight against that. And I would say to a student who's in that situation, to document what the teacher said, to take some notes, what you said, what she said, and take it to people outside, take it to your parents, take it to the people in your church, and have people come and support you, because we need to support our students. Take it to the higher ups, take it to her or his bosses. But one of the things I think is interesting about this time is that these laws, the letter of the law speaks to it. So I think it would be a good idea to say that it's against the law for teachers to say that, because I do feel discomfort. The law doesn't specify, even though we know the intent, it does not specify who is being who is feeling discomfort and why.
Yeah,
Now
sure.
we know the intent, but the law doesn't say that. So can't we use the law and say, it's against the law for you to teach me that because you're making me feel discomfort? And since we're the
Yeah.
majority, I think if we did that enough, they might have to either admit what the law is really about or change the law.
Yeah, it would seem that the law is ripe for a claim by a neo-Nazi that they're being made uncomfortable by a teaching of the United States as the moral kind of architect of the victory in World War II, right? So it would seem like it's ripe, although I wouldn't want to support such an individual. It does seem like the kind of case that an ACLU would get behind on the principle of it all. Yeah. And Dr. Toldson, in terms of your work at Howard, how does this assault on education play out for your kind of like the way you see it on campus? Is there an effect there, or is there some kind of protective space that HBCUs occupy, or would that be a myth?
No, it's sacred ground. We are Black history, and we see Black history in our halls. We see it, the names of our buildings, and we hear it in our classrooms. So we're certainly conscious and sensitive to the issues that's happening around us, and we also know that we have a responsibility and a moral obligation to prepare students that know the truth and will go out and fight for the truth.
All right, I see that we're joined by, I think, someone you know pretty well, Dr. Yohuru Williams here.
Ivory, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Always great to see you.
Yeah, you too.
And you bought it as usual. Ivory, I have to ask you, Dr. Toldson, I have to ask you in particular, if you were to recommend to individuals considering going into the teaching profession right now, one piece of advice and one piece of literature, what would that advice be, and what would that piece of literature be?
That's a hard one, but the first one that came to mind was Lies My Teacher Told Me. That was a really powerful book for me, and I learned a lot from that book, and it inspired me to learn more. And I would say that the field of education is changing, and right now it feels like it's changing for the worse. But that's only because things were getting better. We weren't having these conversations when I was being taught that false lesson. Those lessons were normalized then. And what we're seeing is a result of people who have been fighting and resisting. We're seeing the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We're seeing people talking about diversifying the teacher workforce, inclusive education, things that we just weren't talking about 20 years ago. And so the reason why it seems like things are getting worse is because we have this partisan backlash to some progress that's being made. So despite the way that it looks, this probably is a good time to get into education because of that tipping point that was already happening. Things may seem and feel bad right now, but they're only that way because we were moving in the right direction. Sometimes you have to take a step back, 2 steps forward is 1 step back. You know how that goes. So I think it's a good time to get into education.
I have to tell you, one of the things that I appreciated for those of us that have followed you for a very long time and appreciate your work, I remember a few years back, you talking about even the way that people talk about youth of color, in particular young men of color, as endangered species. And in a way, and how problematic that language is and was and is and continues to be. And yet in this moment, it seems that what's also endangered is this history that provides, things that you were working with in the journal to try to promote in terms of the literature, so that there was this base of scholarship that people would have access to as a corrective.
Yeah.
As you think about, again, the landscape now, what would your message be to researchers in particular? Because I can't pass up the opportunity having you on to say, as you're looking at the landscape now and thinking about the future, what should folks that are thinking about education research be considering in terms of supporting the work of the teaching of Black history, the African diaspora, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I started this presentation talking about the new majority of parents, and that's parents of color. And when we think about this new majority and this move to not normalize whiteness, because we have this legislation that doesn't have to say this for white people, but because we normalize white people, that's who it seems to be intended for. We should not do that in our research. We shouldn't make that same mistake in our research. We shouldn't minoritize us in the research, and we shouldn't normalize white people in the research. We need to look at, if you're doing research on Black people, look at the Black experience. Don't do comparative research unless you're trying to look at white supremacy explicitly. But if you're not explicitly looking at the impact of white supremacy, then you don't have to compare Black people to white people. You can look at just Black people. You can look at the ones that are succeeding and the ones that need help, and compare the ones that are succeeding to the ones that need help. And you can generate much better findings that way. So that's what I would say, to not use white people as a norm reference group, to use asset-based and to normalize the new majority. Just because a group of Black people don't share the same characteristics as a group of white people doesn't mean that there's pathology in that group of Black people. That might just mean that that's what the new norms are, and deal with those norms, and look at the best in what we're doing as a way to, or as your benchmark of the promotion of success.
I got to tell you, Dr. Toldson, you can't hear the chorus here of mms and yeses and everything. We love you. We love your work. Thank you so much for joining us, brother. And we will see you soon. Thank you again for spending some time with us.
Yeah, I love you too, brother. Thanks for doing this.
Take care.